The richest man in Rome wrote an entire book defending the idea that wealth is worthless. He owned villas scattered across Italy and Egypt. He lent enormous sums to foreign tribes at interest. Ancient historians say his loans in Britain were so aggressive that calling them in helped trigger one of the largest revolts the Roman Empire ever faced, the rebellion led by Queen Boudica. By modern estimates, his personal fortune would be worth somewhere close to $4 billion today, built while he was the most famous philosopher in the empire, telling everyone else that chasing money was a trap. That man was Seneca, and for almost 2,000 years, people have used exactly those facts to call him a fraud, a philosopher who taught poverty while living like an emperor, a hypocrite who lectured other people about detachment from money while quietly becoming one of the richest men alive. Here's what almost nobody asks. What if that contradiction isn't a contradiction at all? What if the exact mindset that made Seneca look like a hypocrite is the same mindset that made him rich in the first place and kept him rich while men around him lost everything? By the end of this video, you'll understand the actual Stoic position on money, why it has nothing to do with rejecting wealth, and why the people who genuinely live by it tend to end up financially stronger than the people chasing money the hard way. Let's start with what the Stoics actually taught, because most people get this wrong immediately. Stoic philosophy divides everything in life into two categories. There's virtue, meaning your character, your choices, your judgment. That's the only thing the Stoics called genuinely good. And then there's everything else. Health, reputation, status, your body, how long you live, and yes, money. The Stoics had a specific word for this second category, indifference. Not because these things don't matter at all, but because they don't determine whether your life is good or bad. A wealthy fool is still a fool. A poor person of strong character still has the one thing that actually counts. Here's the part people skip past. Indifferent does not mean you're supposed to avoid it. The Stoics were extremely clear that some indifferents are worth pursuing and others are worth avoiding, even though none of them change your fundamental worth as a person. Health is worth pursuing over sickness. Having resources is worth pursuing over poverty. The Stoics called these preferred indifference. Wealth falls into that category. You are allowed to want it. You are allowed to build it. What you are not allowed to do, according to this philosophy, is let your sense of self hang on whether you have it. There's actually a third tier most people never hear about, dispreferred indifference. Things like poverty, sickness, and bad reputation, worth avoiding if you reasonably can, still not capable of making you a bad person if they happen anyway. Pursue health over sickness, resources over poverty, but never confuse any of that with the actual measure of your worth. That measure only comes from your choices. That single distinction is the whole video. Write it down if you need to. The Stoics never said money is bad. They said your relationship to money is what determines whether it helps you or destroys you. So if that's true, why did almost every major Stoic figure end up wealthy or powerful? Seneca is the obvious case, but he's not alone. Marcus Aurelius controlled the entire treasury of the Roman Empire as emperor, with access to more material wealth than almost any human being in history up to that point. And yet, in Meditations, the private journal he never intended anyone else to read, he writes himself reminders to stay plain, unadorned, free of the artificial polish wealth and palace life constantly pressured him toward. Nobody was supposed to read those private notes. That's a man actually managing the tension between having everything and being controlled by nothing. Cato the Younger gives you the same pattern from a different angle. He was famous in his own time for two things simultaneously, being one of the wealthiest senators in Rome and being so incorruptible that his name became shorthand for integrity, used by his political enemies and allies alike as the standard nobody else could meet. These weren't men who failed to live up to their own philosophy. The wealth wasn't an accident that happened despite their beliefs. There's a mechanism here, and once you see it, you'll understand exactly how it works. It's worth being fair here too, because not every major Stoic figure ended up wealthy, and that strengthens the argument rather than weakening it. Epictetus, one of the most influential Stoic teachers, was born into slavery, freed later in life, and lived in genuine, lifelong simplicity by choice. He owned almost nothing and was by every account completely content. The philosophy never promised wealth as the outcome. It promised peace as the outcome, regardless of which direction the money went. But first, let's deal with the accusation directly, because this wasn't just internet-era cynicism projected backward onto a dead philosopher. Seneca faced this exact criticism while he was alive, from a named political rival. The Roman historian Tacitus records that a senator called Suilius Rufus stood up and publicly accused Seneca of accumulating his fortune through extortion and aggressive moneylending, all while lecturing everyone else about the dangers of wealth. It wasn't a vague rumor, it was a formal public attack from a man who had every political reason to make it land. Seneca had to answer that, and the work he wrote to do it, called On the Happy Life, is sharper than most people give it credit for. His argument goes like this: a wise person is not forbidden to being wealthy. What matters is how the wealth was acquired, how it's held, and how easily it could be released. If the money came through honest means, if the person doesn't grasp at it with anxious desperation, and if losing it tomorrow wouldn't break them, then wealth and wisdom aren't in conflict. The problem was never having money. The problem is being owned by it. Seneca gives a simple test buried in this idea. Could you lose it all tomorrow and still be fundamentally the same person? Not comfortable, but the same person, with the same judgment, the same sense of who you are. If yes, the wealth was never controlling you. If no, you've quietly become a servant to your own bank account, and the slide from having money to needing money to feel like yourself never feels dramatic. It feels like normal life until the money is threatened. Now here's where this stops being a philosophy lecture and starts being a financial strategy, because this mindset directly changes how people make decisions with money, and it changes them for the better. Think about almost every disastrous financial decision you've ever seen someone make. Panic selling investments the moment the market drops, locking in a loss that would have recovered if they just waited, taking on debt to keep up appearances at a lifestyle they can't actually afford, financing a car or a vacation or a wardrobe to look successful to people who honestly aren't tracking their finances as closely as they imagine, jumping into a speculative trend at the worst possible moment, buying into whatever everyone online is suddenly excited about because the fear of missing out becomes unbearable, then watching it collapse right after they bought in, refusing to leave a bad business deal or a bad job because their identity is wrapped up in the income, even when the situation is clearly failing and every signal says get out. Every single one of these mistakes traces back to the same root cause, an emotional, fear-driven, or craving-driven relationship with money, rather than a clear, reasoned one. This is exactly what Stoic detachment is built to remove, not the desire for financial security, the fear and the craving that hijack your judgment when money is involved. If you've seen the video on Seneca's 3 morning habits, you already know one of the specific tools the Stoics used for this, the practice of mentally rehearsing loss in advance so it stops having the power to ambush you emotionally. That single habit alone explains a huge part of why these men made calmer, sharper decisions while people around them were making panicked ones. There's a deeper paradox underneath all of this too, and it shows up far outside Stoic philosophy as well. The people who chase money directly as the goal itself tend to make worse decisions with it. Desperation leads to bad bets, impulsive choices, shortcuts that blow up later. The people who instead chase competence, patience, and sound judgment and treat money as a byproduct of doing things well rather than the target itself consistently end up in a stronger financial position. Seneca wasn't rich because he wanted to be rich. He was rich because operating with discipline, foresight, and a refusal to be ruled by fear or vanity happens to be an extremely effective way to manage money, completely independent of any specific investment strategy. So how do you actually apply this instead of just nodding along with the idea? There are 3 specific principles buried in Seneca's writing that translate directly into financial behavior. The first principle, judge wealth by its use, not by its size. Seneca argues the value of money isn't in the number itself, it's in what that number lets you do without fear or compulsion. Practically, this means defining what enough actually looks like for your life, instead of letting the target quietly move every time you get closer to it. Hit that number and redirect surplus into investing, building something, or supporting people around you. People without a defined enough tend to grasp no matter how much they accumulate, because the goalpost was never fixed in the first place. The second principle: rehearse scarcity on purpose before you're ever forced into it. In one of his letters to his friend Lucilius, Seneca described deliberately living for a few days at a time on the bare minimum, eating plain food, sleeping without comfort, just to prove to himself that poverty wasn't actually something to fear the way most people fear it. This wasn't about punishment, it was inoculation. If you've already proven to yourself that you can survive, even thrive, with very little, then losing money later doesn't carry the same psychological threat. Financially, this looks like intentionally living below your means even when you don't have to, so your baseline tolerance for hard times stays sharp instead of getting soft from comfort. It can be as simple as picking 1 month a year to run your spending the way you would if your income dropped by half, just to confirm you'd actually be fine. Most people who try this discover the version of their life with far less money is more livable than the fear in their head was telling them, and that single discovery quietly removes a huge amount of the anxiety driving bad financial decisions in the first place. The third principle: separate your identity from your balance sheet deliberately and regularly. This is the thread running through almost every Stoic text on externals, the idea that your worth as a person cannot be measured by anything outside your own choices. Practically, this means running a simple check on yourself periodically. If your accounts went to zero tomorrow, would you still know exactly who you are, what you stand for, and what you're capable of rebuilding? Notice what you actually introduce yourself with in your own head when you think about your value. If the honest first answer is a job title, an income bracket, or a net worth figure, that's the signal that money has quietly slipped from being a tool you use to being the foundation your entire identity sits on. That's the exact trap Seneca spent his life trying to avoid, and the exact trap that destroys people who otherwise had every advantage, because the moment the external thing wobbles, their entire sense of self wobbles with it. And this is also the real answer to the hypocrisy accusation that's followed Seneca for 2,000 years. He wasn't pretending to reject wealth while secretly loving it. He held wealth the way this entire philosophy says you're supposed to hold anything external, usefully, not desperately. And his own life is the clearest possible proof of that, because he didn't just theorize about losing everything, he actually lived through it. Years before he became one of the wealthiest men in Rome, the Emperor Caligula had him exiled, stripped of his standing, and reportedly came close to having him executed outright over a political accusation. He lost his position, his security, and very nearly his life, with nothing guaranteeing he'd ever get it back. When he was eventually recalled and rebuilt his career under a different emperor, he didn't rebuild it from a place of fear, grasping at every opportunity to make sure that loss could never happen again. He built it the same disciplined way he taught, which is exactly why when later political storms hit, storms that completely destroyed other powerful Romans around him, he kept surviving them. Men with less of that internal stability lost everything when the political winds shifted under Nero's increasingly unstable reign. Estates confiscated, some forced into suicide to avoid execution. Seneca's relationship with money meant he could lose enormous amounts later in life and still function, think clearly, and rebuild if needed. That resilience wasn't luck. It was the direct output of not needing the money to know who he was, tested twice, not just once. So when someone tells you the Stoics taught that money doesn't matter, you can correct them. They taught that your peace shouldn't depend on it.
There's one more piece of this most people never hear about, a specific test Seneca apparently ran on himself to check whether he'd quietly grown too attached to everything he'd built. And it's almost the opposite of what you'd expect a wealthy man to do on purpose. That's exactly what the next video is going to dig into. So when you hear someone dismiss Stoicism as a philosophy for people who don't care about money, you now know that's a misreading. It's a philosophy for people who refuse to let money decide how they feel, how they think, or who they are. And the side effect of that discipline, again and again across every figure we've looked at, is that the money tends to take care of itself. If this gave you a different way to think about money, subscribe, because every video on this channel takes one piece of Stoic philosophy and turns it into something you can actually use, not just admire.